Welcome back. With the addition of more and more skills into the game, whether that's inheritable weapons, or A slots, or B slots, or C slots, or whatever the case may be, obviously some archetype is going to get a boost, while other ones are still going to be left to rot. And I want to discuss my overall thoughts on which archetype really needs the most help. It's ranged flyers, spoilers, it's ranged flyers, but also to give some sort of perspective onto all the archetypes that we have in the game and what they're able to accomplish on their own based on whether they have a PRF or the amount of skills they have access to. So I want to just talk about that for a bit. Nothing too crazy, just something simple. But yeah, no more intro. Let's just get started with the infantry units. I would argue that infantry and armor units probably have the best skill accessibility at the moment, regardless of their range type, mainly because most of the skills that they do have access to aren't necessarily melee or range locked. Some of them are, but a majority of the ones that allow them to compete aren't locked specifically to specific weapon types. So for example, if we were to talk about the melee ones for a second, they have access to an assortment of skills such as Flashing Blade, Times Pulse, Tempo, No Follow-Up, No Counter Disrupt, Special Spiral. Infantry, while having some of the weakest movement in the game, make up for that fact with the amount of skills they have access to. So even a generic demote like Gi can run a Gale Force set with Ninja Katana, Flashing Blade, Times Pulse, No Follow-Up, and they can function really well in the player phase. But even with units that have defined PRFs such as Jump, who has a guaranteed follow-up in their weapon, they could opt for something such as Speed Defense Tempo, so they can always get their Dead going off. Or you could go with somebody like Ascended Merida, who could stack an absurd amount of damage reduction, has no follow-up built into her weapon, Slaying, Mini Spiral, so on and so forth. You also have units like Winter Altina, who can use stuff like No Counter Disrupt, and if she's able to get her Vantage Harmonic skill off, then she can act as a Vantage unit and counterattack regardless of whatever skills may prevent them from counterattacking. Of course, these are units with defined PRFs, the ones that have notable speed stats, so they're able to take advantage of stuff like this, especially damage reduction, since most of it does rely on having a speed stat. Of course, dragons being the exception since they can run stuff like Dragon Wall, but at that point you would need a notable res stat. But then if we get into stuff like slow infantry units, then they have less to work with, mainly because they can't take advantage of these skills that heavily rely on having a notable speed stat or some sort of notable attack stat that allows them to function in the player phase with something such as a Brave Sword, for example. So slow units such as Summer Hellbindi will probably be tied to stuff like Quick Riposte, which is going to be their only means of doubling in the enemy phase, which kind of sucks if you think about it because they can't really function nearly as well as their speedy counterparts. If there's anything that infantry units are lacking, it's skills that allow slower infantry units to function. They can, again, still use Quick Riposte, they can use Droid Drives, Unities, yada 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 yada, so they could stack up their better stats and don't have to worry about taking as much damage, but the moment they get hit by an impact effect or no follow-up effect or anything of the sort, then they're not going to be able to reliably double. They could always use something like Spirited Sword or Spirited Axe or Lance and then run Special Spiral, so that way they can set up Ignis triggers and spam that no matter what, if the idea is just to spam one-hit KOs as much as possible. So even with the lack of notable skills for slow infantry units, there is stuff they can work with, which is a lot better than some of the other archetypes that we have, such as Cavalry, who also really function best when they have a notable speed stat, such as Sane, Kent, Elliewood. They have stuff such as Near Trace, Flows, Lulls. Now, Lulls aren't locked to Cavs, they can also be used on infantry, but they also have a lot more competitive options, which is why I don't really think it's worth highlighting for infantry in particular. Although you could still make the same argument with Cavalry because they also have Flows and Near Trace, which are also really good. Flow skills basically give them a player phase no follow-up effect, which basically guarantees their doubles provided that they have the speed to make that double, which is really nice because they don't have to worry about skills that will negate their follow-up. Plus, with the added benefit of flows comes another effect depending on the one you use, so Flow Refresh will grant 10 HP after combat, Flow Guard will inflict guard on the enemy during combat, so on and so forth. It really just depends on the flow skill. You also have Near Trace, which can be super great for hit and run strategies, especially when paired with Gale Force. So if you were to go in, trigger Gale Force, and then attack the opponent right next to that foe, then you can basically retreat with up to 3 to 4 movement, depending on how much you extend. I would argue that Near Trace is probably one of their best options, simply because hit and run is just a really potent strategy. But of course, that doesn't stop you from using something like Lulls, which are still fairly decent, all things considered, because they do inflict debuffs on the foe and nullify any sort of visible buff the foe may have, meaning that it can be easier to secure stuff such as Heavy Blade checks, or doubles, or kills, or whatever the case may be, depending on which one you're using. But again, this mainly applies to all of the fast ones. The slow cavalry units are going to be a bit of an issue when it comes to just overall usage, because unless they have a defined PRF that allows them to function either in both phases or in the enemy phase, then they're out of luck. Units like Dusel and Fallen Berkut have their guaranteed follow-up attacks. They have all sorts of other things in their weapon too, so they don't really have to worry about their speed stat. They can function in both phases, provided that you can meet their condition, which shouldn't be hard to do. So they can still run stuff like lulls. However, if you get to units that don't have a defined PRF, or any notable inheritables such as Valentine's Conrad, they're stuck with Quick Riposte again, which, again, is fine if you want to make them a melee specialist, but comparatively to their infantry counterparts, yes, a lot of them are going to function the same as a melee specialist, but the fact that infantry can also have access to stuff like Null Counter Disrupt or Special Spiral means that they have a little bit more flexibility in what they can do as a melee specialist, as opposed to cavalry units that have to rely on Quick Riposte, and in some cases have to go up against units that have cavalry effective weaponry, which, while aren't nearly as common as stuff like flyer effectiveness, is still something that can prove to be an issue. And of course, we have armors who basically get everything they want. They get whatever they want. They have every fighter they need. They have near save, they have far save, they have hardy fighter, which that's a whole nother can of worms I'm not going to get into. They have all sorts of things that allow them to function in both phases, one heavily favoring the enemy phase in my opinion, but even then there are means of using player phase armors, albeit to a certain extent. I don't think there's a single armor in this game that just can't function nowadays, especially if they have one of the worst stat lines in the game, maybe like Sheena. Even Sheena, even with like a really outdated PRF and a terrible stat line, can still do a lot more than a lot of other units in other archetypes, which says a lot for how potent fighter skills and save skills really are, but that's all enemy phase centric. So what about the player phase? Well, the player phase units now have Assault Troop, which, while isn't locked to any movement types, definitely benefits armors a lot because they have the ability to move 3 spaces, provided that there aren't any skills that prevent any sort of warping, such as Gatekeeper or Warp Bubble, or anything like that. As long as that isn't in the picture, they'll be fine, ready, good to go. So they can run stuff like Assault Troop, Gale Force, Bold Fighter, whatever the case may be. Even the ranged armors can still use Bold Fighter, and even though they can't Gale Force per se, it's still something that they can do in the player phase. But even then, I would still say armors definitely are a lot more enemy phase centric, but the ones that can player phase can probably do it quite well. And then we get to the final archetype in Flyers. And I'll be fair, melee flyers definitely have a lot more going for them. They have access to flow skills, flight skills, near trace. They can still function quite well in the player phase, provided that they have the right stats for it. So someone like Cormag without a defined PRF can run something like Flow Flight, a Rain, Catch, whatever the case may be. They can go in, Gale Force, do whatever they need to do. Or you can run near trace and act as a hit and run unit. Albeit they only have 2 movement, but they can use stuff like Tempest skills so they can extend their movement if they really need to. Still, I would only argue that near chase is probably going to be better on cavalry units because they have way better movement, and it really functions better with Gale Force if you're going to attempt hit and run strategies, in my opinion. But even then, the melee flyers still have quite a bit going for them, provided that, again, you have the speed stat. And if they don't have a speed set, they can at least use Guard Bearing if they just want to minimize the amount of damage they take in the enemy phase. But even then, that's kind of pushing it, because if they get doubled, they're still taking quite a lot of damage as opposed to a unit that is speedy and is only taking 1 hit. And of course, you have dragons who can still use their dragon skills, and that's a whole different discussion in my opinion. But the fact that they have access to stuff like Dragon Wall, or Dragon's Ire, or Dragon's Wrath, or so on and so forth, means that they can still function regardless of their movement type. But being any other type than a flyer definitely has its perks. But then you get to the ranged flyers, which definitely struggle a lot more because they don't have access to any of these skills. Obviously, they can still use stuff like aerobatics, formation, yada 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 yada. It allows them to teleport all over the place, which is really nice for supports. So someone like Peony doesn't really have to worry about her archetype all too much, provided she isn't an armor dancer, but because she's a flying dancer, she can actually reliably teleport around and dance her allies, which is really, really nice. But this is only for support. The units that have to enter combat that are ranged definitely struggle a lot more. However, I would argue that fast bows and fast daggers are probably okay at the moment. Fast bows recently got Whitecap bow, which is just a player phase bow that grants extra speed, extra attack. It doesn't have a might penalty, and if they have 10 more speed over the foe, they can attack twice, which is really nice because that means they can run stuff like Wind Sweep and Water Sweep, so they can avoid taking damage in the player phase, which is really, really good. Meanwhile, you have Courtly Fan on Speedy Daggers, which allows them to pretty much do the same thing. They don't get Brave hits, but because they have half null follow-up, it means that they can secure their own doubles, and they can also do stuff like Wind Sweep, Catch, Blade Session, whatever the case may be. And I was going to talk about slow bow and dagger flyers, but there really aren't any, and the ones that are purely supportive or dancers, such as New Year Plumeria or Masquerade Lakeisa, so I didn't think it was worth talking about them here because they're all support. But the mage flyers, in my opinion, are the ones that arguably struggle the most. More so the slow ones. The speedy ones can at least do something maybe like Spooky Sensor, Triple Fury, Desperation, which isn't really the best, obviously, but it's better than nothing, and at least allows them to function in the player phase, as opposed to pretty much nothing. However, this only applies to blue and green tomes. The red tomes don't really have that. They have Luminous Grace, but that's counterproductive to Desperation because it heals them every turn, so it's not really good there. Red tomes don't really have as much, but at least if they're fast, they can maybe run something else. But the slow ones don't really have anything beyond their bulk, and if their bulk isn't really that good, then they're pretty much screwed. Not only do the flyers have to worry about flyer effectiveness from bows, which are pretty common, but they also have to rely on Whip Riposte if they don't have a dedicated PRF that allows them to naturally double, which most of them don't. So having to run Quick Riposte with IO Shield means that they're already kind of a liability in the enemy phase, but combine that with their limited BST means that they have even less defensive stats to work with. Even the min-max ones, such as Summer Levitate, don't really have the best bulk at max merge, which is pretty unfortunate, but what can you do? Intelligent Systems refuses to give something to these units, but maybe they'll do it in the future, who can say? But at least with Whitecap Bow and Courtly Fan, the speedier flying units can at least do something there, but the slower ones or the mage ones are definitely going to struggle a lot more. But yeah, that's pretty much it when it comes to all of these archetypes. I didn't really cover beasts because I feel like they already have enough going for them since they're all defined by their PRF anyway. The infantry ones still have their infantry skills. Granted, they can't use damage reduction, but they could still use Times Pulse, no follow-up, no counter, whatever the case may be. The cav ones still have Trace and their impact skill, but they can't use flows, which kind of sucks. But from the way I'm seeing it, they're going to start implementing it into their weapon and during their refines. However, that's just speculation, just based on the first two that we got, because it seems like they can't really function without some sort of flow effect built into their weapon. The flyer ones have 3 movements, so they can abuse Near Trace, which is really nice. And then the armor ones have distant counter built into their weapons. And I don't really have to talk about the armor ones because they have saves and they have fighter skills, so they aren't struggling there. So I figured I'd just talk about the ones that were worth highlighting. But whatever the case may be, that's the video. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.